Today's guest is Tim Baker, and Tim's a best-selling and award-winning surf rider whose life seemed like a dream come true. And with a beautiful family, a lifetime of exotic travel, and a home near the waves that he loved, everything appeared picture perfect. However, on July 7, 2015, Tim's life took an unexpected turn when he was diagnosed out of the blue with stage 4 metastatic prostate cancer. In an instant, Tim's world shifted and he found himself in the throes of aggressive cancer treatments. And doctors discussed survival rates and treatment plans, but Tim's focus extended beyond mere survival, and he sought to heal and live a life worth living. Tim's latest book is called Patting the Shark, and it's an honest and deep dive into his experiences living a life worth living whilst having cancer. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Ash. Lovely introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. It's I like the guests to hear the introduction. I feel it can help sometimes help people land and yeah, I'm curious around. So, there's a cancer diagnosis and this podcast is beyond turning points, right? And so there's life before, there's the diagnosis, life after, which is, this idea of these pivotal moments. Do you want to share what it was like to get the diagnosis?
Yeah, sure. It's pretty hard to put into words because, I mean, it's unlike any other experience I've ever had in my life. I can't think of any other kind of threshold you cross in life where things are just so irrevocably changed from that point on. Maybe having a child in a much more joyous sort of way. But yeah, I just remember sitting in the urologist's office. I'd had a series of tests. I'd just gone for a routine post turning 50 checkup, and it had quickly become apparent there was something awry. I'd done the physical digital examination of the prostate, and then I had a blood test, and that rang some alarm bells, and I was sent for scans. And then I came back to the urologist to get the result of the scans. And really the critical moment was when he slid the scan up on his he had a wall mounted light box. And I remember with a pen, he pointed to this large kind of black smudge where my right femur or thigh bone should be. And he said, "This more or less confirms our suspicions." And it just felt like everything stopped at that point. In a book, I say it was like this feedback loop of dissonance, like a needle stuck in a record, like this can't be happening, this is happening. If this can't be happening, this is happening. And your brain just can't quite compute what you're hearing and what's going on. So to be told in pretty abrupt terms, I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic prostate cancer, which means it has spread beyond the prostate to the bone, at which point it's considered incurable and ultimately fatal, and that there was a range of treatments that were all pretty toxic and debilitating, which could keep me alive and keep the cancer at bay for some unspecified time. And that was about as far as it went. And you're kind of given a brochure and a few referrals, and an appointment to see an oncologist about further treatment, and sent on your way. And I just couldn't quite believe it, that you just received such grim news and then you just sent back out into the world to kind of carry on, it sort of felt like, I don't know, maybe someone should be doing something to help support me and guide me through this. But yeah, you're really left to just sink or swim. I found it kind of shocking, to be honest.
Yeah. And do you think your book is part of that guidance now, that there's this resource for people that do go through an experience like that?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's funny because the book started really just as therapy for me. I started sitting here on this couch where I'm sitting right now, where I can see the ocean. And in those early weeks and months where my world felt so kind of tilted off its axis, and nothing made sense, and some mornings I just sit and free write, just move pen across the page and see what spilled out the end, just as a way of trying to process what I was going through. And some days it'd just be sort of gibberish, and other days there'd be something there that felt helpful. And then occasionally something would just spill out that felt kind of fully formed, just some short vignette or almost like an essay of something I was wrestling with. And over time, I just kind of built up a folder of these little things. Like if something felt like there was some merit to it, I'd sort of transcribe it into my laptop. And then, over time, I just felt like, maybe there was something there, and that, what I was going through, because I'd felt so on my own with it, that, maybe I could use my experience to offer that sort of guidance to others.
Yeah, I hear about the aloneness. I know, when I've had times in my life when there's been, serious medical things occur, and that everybody else was at work.
Yeah.
And
it's really isolating. And I think that's one of the more difficult and maybe less talked about things. People talk about the toxicity of treatments and financial stress and stuff like that. But it just kind of felt like life was going on, and I was just kind of looking at it through a pane of glass or something, in this separate kind of chamber of just desperation. And that maybe it was something that people found difficult to kind of be around or engage with, almost like it might be contagious, which, obviously cancer isn't. But, I was lucky I had some really good friends who were really able to kind of step up and hold space and be with me no matter how messy they found me,
Yeah.
And, I had my family, my wife and 2 kids, but they're so close to it and they're living with it. It's hard for them to be a sort of your main source of support, because they're also victims of it, if you know what I mean. Like, they need support as well. So it was just a super difficult time. And, in hindsight, I can see lots of ways that it could be made easier. And in the book, I kind of spell out, some of those ideas. And I've since had the opportunity to speak quite a bit about this in different settings, just to try and promote, I guess, what you might call just a more holistic or integrative model of cancer care, and prostate cancer specifically, because it presents some very specific challenges for men, and where relevant, their partners and families, I guess.
Yeah. And I'm curious about your priorities. So the diagnosis, and then, there's this theme around we're mortal, but we forget that we're mortal.
Yeah, 100%.
And I know that from my own experience, was like, oh shit, life is really short.
And fragile.
Yeah. And life now for me, it's like, how do I live this to the fullest in the way that honors me? And I'm curious around your priorities after the diagnosis and now.
Yeah. Oh, look, initially it was just survival instincts kicking in, what can I do? I remember a good mate of mine who was personal trainer. He said something that really stuck with me. He said, you sort of, you're processing the shock and the kind of grief. You kind of need to move from why to what, like from why this happened to what you're going to do about it. And he kind of encouraged me to come down to the gym where he worked, and he designed a program for me, and I just started doing pretty hardcore physical training as just one way to try and stay fit and healthy, to kind of, I guess, maintain some quality of life and some general health and well-being while going through what were pretty nasty treatments. And very quickly I was like, okay, so what am I going to do? One of my first thoughts was meditation. I'd done a Vipassana retreat about 14 years earlier, when my wife was pregnant with our first child, as a kind of preparation for parenthood. But my practice had sort of dropped off over time. And I remember very quickly having the thought, like, I've got to get back into my meditation. I just had this instant kind of inner knowing that that was going to be really key. And then the other things that sort of kind of came up as, you know, my own ways of coping were exercise and diet. So I really quickly kind of overhauled my diet and followed a really pretty strict kind of plant-based diet. And yeah, was really focused on exercise and the meditation. And I went, yeah, pretty hard, pretty quick. And I think in hindsight, it was a bit extreme. Like, I lost 15 kilos in the first month after my diagnosis.
Wow.
And, you know, so the people around me were kind of freaked out because, you know, people always have this vision of the kind of wasted cancer victim. But I'd lost weight because I just started eating really clean and just, you know, not eating bread or sugar or dairy or meat, and no alcohol or coffee, you know, pretty much just plant-based, a bit of fish. And the weight just kind of fell off me. I think I was carrying extra weight, and I actually felt great. I went from about 95 kilos to about 80. And I felt fantastic, you know, but at the same time, everyone's like, oh God, I've heard you're really sick. And then of course I went through chemo and my hair fell out. And so then you kind of look like a cancer patient. But apart from the few days after each chemo cycle where I felt pretty crook, you know, most of the time I still felt reasonably well. You know, I was still surfing, and my son was 9 at the time and just mad keen surfer. And so he wasn't going to be kind of deterred from getting his saltwater fix just because Dad was going through chemo. You know, he'd wake me up early and drag me out of bed, and I always say he was like my greatest healer. You know, because he just coaxed me into the ocean, no matter what the surf was like, and that was such a beautiful kind of thread to my old life. You know, like, it's not, you can't kind of go back. What is something I've realized with a diagnosis like this, there's no point trying to get back to your old life. You've got to move forward to a new life. But surfing was this beautiful continuum, you know, this lovely thread that still ran through my life. And I always say I've never been more grateful to be a surfer than since my diagnosis, because it just felt like the perfect therapy. And in terms of priorities, I guess over time, I eventually, and it probably took a few years, I think it was probably about 3 years out, that I realized, you know, survival kind of couldn't be my only goal. That if that was my focus, then I was kind of always on tenterhooks waiting for the next scan result or the next blood test. I'd been to a couple of retreats with a guy named Ian Gawler, a kind of noted cancer survivor. And he's very big on the idea of, you know, making peace with one's mortality. And he likes to say that an acceptance of our mortality is entirely compatible with a will to live, which is a phrase I really like and became quite key for me. That, you know, the way he told it, once we can truly accept our mortality, we're not kind of using our emotional energy trying to hold it at bay. We accept that we're all dying and we're all going to die, and that actually just frees you up to heal. And so that became a really core philosophy for me. And the other thing he said that was really influential was believe the diagnosis, but not the prognosis. So, you know, you've been told you have stage 4 metastatic prostate cancer, but when a doctor says, based on statistical averages, you might have 5 or 6 years to live, that's based on statistical averages, right? And so, you know, he would say, as a unique individual, those statistics need not apply to you. And the reality is survival times for most cancers form a kind of bell curve. If you can picture, you know, there's a block of time. If most men with metastatic prostate cancer die at around the 5 to 6 year mark, small numbers of men die sooner, then most die in that hump of 5 to 6 years. But one of the things my oncologist said was on these bell curves, there's a really long tail, which represents small numbers of men who live much, much longer, 10, 15, even 20 years in some cases. And no one seems to really know why, which is odd to me. Like, isn't that something we could study, you know?
You think it'd be one of the first things to study?
Yeah, it's crazy. I always say, you know, oncology is one of those weird and perhaps one of the only human endeavors in which we don't study the success stories.
Yeah.
You know, people who achieve these radical, spontaneous remissions are kind of dismissed as statistical anomalies.
Yeah.
And that bears no sort of influence on, you know, standard care or treatment protocols, which to me seems kind of nuts, you know.
Yeah.
And
you're
so
turning into one of those statistical anomalies.
well, that's the plan, yeah. You know,
Well,
8 years and counting, and
yeah.
Still fit and well, still surfing, and yeah, I spoke to my oncologist recently about my prognosis, and yeah, he said, you know, based on my latest scans, that you know, I'm still on the frontline treatment. It's sort of hard to explain very briefly, but prostate cancer treatment protocols are sometimes described as being like a frog in a lily pond. And so there's a series of treatments you move through, and each one will become ineffective after a certain amount of time, which no one can predict. So, you know, on the first treatment, which is called hormone therapy or androgen deprivation therapy, which, without getting too technical, prostate cancer feeds on testosterone. And so the treatment is to block or suppress testosterone, which you can imagine as a bloke has a whole lot of unpleasant, unwanted side effects. But you stay on that treatment until it becomes ineffective, because at some point the cancer mutates and that treatment no longer holds the cancer at bay, and you move through a series of treatments. And eventually, at some point, you might run out of treatments. You know, you're a frog jumping from one lily pad to the next, staying on each lily pad until it can no longer support you. I'm still on my first lily pad after 8 years, and that's pretty unusual. And I've been lucky, and I think I've worked hard enough that I've been able to just go on and off medication intermittently. And my sense of it is, and my oncologist tends to agree, that because of that intermittent therapy, that it's actually extended the effective lifespan of the treatment. So that's been a bit of a win. And so I've got lots more treatment options in front of me. I mean, the dream would be to go off medication altogether, to get all the lifestyle stuff so dialed, you know, my diet, exercise, meditation, whatever herbs and supplements might be helpful, that I could actually live a long and healthy life without medication. But I've had extended periods off medication, and then the longest of them was about 12 months, and then the biomarkers start coming up and the scan shows some what they call subtle progression, and so I either go back on medication or I risk allowing the cancer to spread. So you're kind of playing chicken with your cancer, which is, you know, a strange kind of game, but I've kind of made my peace with it, and the benefits in terms of quality of life and, you know, mitigating the side effects of treatment have been entirely worth it. And, you know, I think I have come a long way in terms of making peace with my mortality. And so now the priority is much more around quality of life and, yeah, living a really rich and full and meaningful life, and getting up each day and deciding what's the most kind of joyous and fulfilling use of my time, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm really curious around, so if your testosterone is being suppressed, is that the right description? How does that then impact your sense of yourself and masculinity and things like that?
Oh, all kinds of things. I mean, from a medical perspective, the side effects of that hormone therapy include loss of bone density, loss of muscle mass, compromised kind of cardiovascular health, increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of suicide, mood swings and depression. And this is the treatment, right?
Yeah.
Loss of libido, loss of erectile function. So it's pretty daunting. And I certainly wasn't given much guidance in how to manage all those side effects. And I've actually, managed to escape the worst of most of them because of that intermittent treatment. So I get regular breaks. But yeah, certainly there was a period, I think the first few years, I just felt like I was never going to be whole again. I just felt like this kind of washed out, hollowed out kind of version of myself. And yeah, you experience fatigue, and yeah, certainly the mood swings were pretty dramatic. There was at one point, again, about 3 years in, I think I kind of hit sort of rock bottom where I was really, experiencing suicidal ideation. It obviously took a huge toll on my marriage and, my ability to be the kind of father I aspire to be. So it just impacted, my ability to work, our financial reality. There are all these kind of offshoots of a cancer diagnosis that kind of don't get talked about that much. So yeah, there was a period about 3 years in where I was in a pretty dark place, and kind of knew I just needed to shift my focus. And I spent a week at a health retreat here on the Gold Coast in the hinterland called Gwingana, and that was really helpful, and that was a bit of a reset. And I came back with this attitude, I think, that survival couldn't be my only goal, that I needed to make my peace with my mortality. And I felt like I was in a really good place and had this new kind of focus. But that also coincided with my then wife announcing that she wasn't sure if we had a future together. And so that was just an enormous blow. And I had to then kind of try and imagine a new life managing cancer on my own. We managed to hold it together for another 4 years, but given the nature of the treatment and my kind of physical sort of realities, the loss of libido and all that kind of thing, we sort of end up more like just mates and co-parents and housemates. It wasn't really like a marriage in the true sense, and I think it was inevitable that we would part ways, but it was still really difficult and really sad. And it's really only now, it's sort of 12 months post separation, that I feel like I'm in a much better place. And there are a lot of highs and lows along the way. That's a very simplified version. Even in the interim, those few years where the marriage felt very shaky, I was still managing to find a lot of joy and meaning in life, and that was through my kids and surfing and writing and friends, community. You're picking up the guitar, having a strum. My meditation became really important. I've done 3 Vipassana retreats since my diagnosis. I think I've developed a good ability to just kind of sit with difficult feelings and emotions and allow them to move through. I think that's meant that I've got to this point in my life now feeling reasonably unburdened by a lot of that stuff and quite kind of liberated, I think, which is a nice feeling.
So the version of you pre-diagnosis and the version of you now, what are some of the key things that version of you had to let go to be where you are now?
Look, I think I'm a better person for the experience, for sure. You got to let go of a lot of, just the striving to kind of work and earn and achieve some things in a kind of professional realm. Like, all that stuff doesn't feel that important. Although, oddly enough, in letting go of that, a lot of that stuff has come to me anyway, through writing the book. I guess there's a lesson in that, that,
Mm.
sometimes when you let go of things, then you're allowed to have them. It's almost like a toddler trying to grab onto something, and while the toddler's screaming and fighting for something, the parent's not going to hand it over. But if the kids chill, it's like, okay, now you can have your treat, or now you can have your toy. It almost
Yeah.
feels a little bit like that,
Yeah, because
Uh,
it's interesting from my perspective watching you over the last 10 years
mm,
and the success of Patting the Shark,
mm,
and that the media engagements, the writers' workshops, the
mm.
writers, what's the right word? Festivals.
Festivals. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And seeing that that's coming from you sharing about you and that authentic
Mm.
perspective that's in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of time, telling other people's stories.
Mm.
And as a journalist, that was kind of comfortable for me. And yeah, sort of telling my own and making myself vulnerable was a whole different thing. But Brene Brown has made it very I guess fashionable to talk about the power of vulnerability, but it's undeniable, in my experience. When you make yourself vulnerable, you give other people permission to be vulnerable. And, the amount of goodwill that I've experienced from people who are just grateful that, a conversation has been started, or that they've drawn some comfort from the book, or, I've spoken at men's sheds and at libraries and cancer conferences and writers festivals in all kinds of different settings. And I've had grown men just cry on my shoulder, and looked into men's eyes who just tell me they've got no joy in their life, and just try and give them a bit of hope and a bit of inspiration that things will get better. It wasn't a role that I ever really envisaged, when I wrote the book, because it's one thing just to sit alone at your desk and write something really raw and candid and vulnerable. And I think to do that, you've got to not be thinking about how it's going to land out in the world, because then you become self-conscious and maybe you self-censor or self-edit. And so then, once it does go out in the world, it just takes on this life of its own. And I couldn't have imagined all the sort of flow-on effects from the book.
Mm.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Mm.
And I saw too that you were doing recently a writing for trauma workshop.
Yeah. Yeah, so I did Byron Writers Festival last year. I've probably done half a dozen writers festivals in the last sort of 12 months. And then they approached me and asked if I'd like to run a writing workshop. And if so, what would I do it on? And I've run plenty of writing workshops in the past. I've done them through schools, and I've done them at writers festivals around, surf writing, or writing about, travel or biography. But when they asked me what I wanted to do, I really sat down and thought about it. And I just thought about how this book had really begun its life as writing therapy, and that it had this incredible sort of resonance in the world. And I felt like maybe that's what I've got to offer that's of most value at this point, And so I suggested this, I called it Writing as Catharsis. And I just sort of mapped out a bit of a plan for it and wrote a blurb for their website and did a fair bit of research just to kind of look at what the sort of academic research around writing therapy was, so that I knew what I wanted to do, what my sort of instinctual approach would be. But I guess I wanted to make sure I was reflecting best practice, and that, I wasn't just going to be re-traumatizing people, or opening Pandora's boxes that I wouldn't know how to deal with. But I had the most extraordinary response. The first one was sold out, and so they asked me to run a second one, which also sold out. And the feedback, because you do participant surveys afterwards, and it's probably the most enthusiastic response I've had to anything I've ever done in my working life. It was quite extraordinary. And even while I was doing it, I stepped into those spaces feeling quite anxious, and feeling like, oh, this is really one of those cases of kind of fake it till you make it.
Yep.
But as soon as I got in the room with a group of people, I just instantly felt like I knew what to do. It was quite an uncanny sensation. And, there were tears and, people were sharing deep trauma. And I just found, I guess, because of what I've been through, that I could hold space, and nothing that was coming up for people made me uncomfortable, that I could just be, I guess, this sort of calm presence in the room, and I guess a kind of emotional ballast for people while they had their responses. And it was such a lovely atmosphere. And yeah, people, I mean, they gave me feedback in the moment, and, there was a really beautiful warmth in the room. But then the Byron Festival would send me the participant surveys, and I was just blown away by the comments. And so that's definitely something I want to do more of. And, I've even thought about maybe doing some kind of training or study for some sort of counseling qualification, because, maybe that's the best use of my skill set. Because sadly, the world's never going to run out of people with trauma. And to be able to play some small role in helping people move through that, it's hard to imagine, more meaningful work, I guess.
Yeah. And my experience is that your presence, you bringing that presence, that's what people remember. And that's something we can't do without the physical form. Like, we can have this, ethereal consciousness and presence, but when there's two people sitting together and one of them's just deeply present, listening and witnessing, it's one of the most powerful experiences that people can have.
Yeah, I think so. And also, I think my meditation practice really held me in good stead too, because they'd be a 6-hour day from like 10 till 4. So it's a long day. I'd sort of break it into sections, but at the start of each section, we just do a very short guided meditation. And I just found that whatever was going on for people, I could just take 5 minutes and get people to tap back into their breath and tap back into their physical bodies, and let the intellectual mind quieten, and all that stuff would just kind of settle. And I just speak very calmly for 5 minutes, speaking them through a very simple sort of focus on the breath. And I'd finish, and you could feel, how much the atmosphere in the room had settled. And it was just kind of like creating a blank canvas, for the next part of the process to take place. And yeah, it was just incredibly gratifying, that people would really go there with you, and then they'd be brave and bold about sharing, and people would write the most beautiful pieces. I think when people make themselves vulnerable and tap into those deepest emotions, it's amazing how just articulate and evocative just the average person can be, even without any kind of writing experience or established writing practice. So yeah, that's been a great revelation, and it's something I can envisage doing a lot more of. I think I need to be mindful of kind of practicing good self-care myself. Like, I think I could definitely overdo it. And so I'm very conscious of when I need to kind of tap out. And that even applies to things like, because I'll get a lot of people approach me now, friends will say, oh, someone I know has just been diagnosed with this or that, could you speak to them? And I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm up for that, and sometimes I just have to be real and kind of go, you know what, I just think at this point I have to kind of walk my talk and practice good self-care. And if something feels too much, or if I feel like I've taken on too much, like, I'm sorry, kind of everything I have to share is in the book. That's kind of why I wrote the book. And I can't speak personally to every person who's approached me for some sort of help, but I can certainly point them towards some resources, and the book, as much as anything, hopefully can be that for people.
Yeah. Well, you are the gift, right? And if you don't take care of the gift, there's no gift for the others to receive.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah,
it's
no, that makes sense for
interesting
sure.
that one around obligation and, oh, I should do this, I should be this, but then it's
Yeah.
damaging the vessel in
Yeah.
the process, and say, okay, actually, that's not the greater good. It's not the good for
Mm.
me.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, even as you speak, I find myself flashing on or emails or phone messages that I might not have returned and how I let someone down. And 5 minutes or 10 minutes of my time could really make a difference in someone's life. But yeah, I just think it's super important that as I say, that I kind of practice what I preach and walk my talk. And as much as life feels really rich and meaningful, and I still feel fit and healthy, I'm very conscious that I can't let myself get run down, that's when things could take a turn for the worse. And so I guess I kind of defend that or guard that pretty carefully too.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm conscious of time. I wanted
Mm.
to chat about the psychedelic assisted therapy.
Sure. One of my favorite topics.
Right. Well, and that's in Australia, it's now legal for accredited
Mm.
psychologists to do that kind of work with
Mm.
people. And it's been underground for a while, as
Mm.
certain other medicines and things like that,
Yeah.
that are called drugs instead or whatever.
Yeah.
And so the something that opened my mind was reading Michael Pollan's book.
Mm. Yeah.
Right. And
Same.
then inadvertently, I ended up having a session with somebody who, one of the key people he mentions in the book from Germany, his assistant who had been working with him for 20 years. I had an assisted session with him,
Oh, wow.
and it was phenomenal. It
Mm.
just blew my mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was, it was definitely things I wouldn't normally take or be interested in taking.
Mm.
But it it was amazing to experience that thing. So I'm curious what your session was like, or your
Yeah.
sessions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I had the same experience. I was driving home from a surf and I heard Michael Pollan being interviewed on Radio National. And I was so interested because I had been that was around the time I'd been suffering depression and my GP had diagnosed antidepressants. And I'd got the script and bought the drug, the antidepressants, but I just didn't take them. I just had some resistance to having another pill to take in my daily regime, and I was worried about the side effects of them. And look, for some people, they can be a wonderful treatment and a real game changer. So I'm certainly not wanting to stigmatize, antidepressants or, seeking mainstream mental health treatment. But for me, managing the cancer diagnosis at the same time, the psychedelic therapy just really resonated with me. And I did a bit more research and I came across an organisation called Mind Medicine Australia, who were running a symposium down in Byron Bay to sort of explain the therapy in more depth. And so I went to that and just found it completely compelling. And, they cite a lot of the academic research. And what really struck me was some clinical trials in the US where they'd given terminal cancer patients a single dose of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, psilocybin or psilocybin, some people call it. And I think in 80% of cases, it had completely eliminated any fear of death in those people. Like it doesn't cure cancer, but it's allowed those people to just live out their lives in complete peace and happiness and, able to have all the conversations that you would wish to have with loved ones. And I just thought, what an incredible result. And, why wouldn't we make this available certainly to a terminal cancer patient? Because, what could possibly be the argument against it, that it's bad for them, when they've got weeks or months left to live. And so I sought out an underground psychedelic therapist who came highly recommended. And I was really impressed with the whole sort of protocol. he gave me a lot of reading material, and there was a bit of a sort of pre-briefing session just so that I really understood what to expect, and a whole lot of guidelines about what to do on the day. And then they talk a lot about set and setting. So being in a really safe and supportive setting, and then setting a real clear intention for the session. And so I went to this guy's place in sort of northern New South Wales, and we had a bit of a chat. And then we talked about, what my intention was, which was to really release what I saw as the locked sort of trauma in my body from the diagnosis. And I took MDMA on that first session. I was really interested in psilocybin, but he said for a first session, he prefers MDMA, what we used to call ecstasy back in the 80s.
Yeah.
Because it's a bit gentler and a bit more predictable than something like psilocybin. And you put on an eye shade and noise cancelling headphones, and he has a curated sort of psychedelic soundtrack, and you just lay down and kind of go on a bit of a trip. And, MDMA is different to other psychedelics. And I hadn't actually thought of it as a psychedelic, because you're not having the kind of visual hallucinations like you would with, mushrooms or acid, things like that. But my understanding is it floods the body with serotonin, which makes you feel really kind of blissful and euphoric. And it takes the amygdala offline, which is the fight or flight response. And so you can actually approach past trauma and feel safe. And so I was able to take myself back to the moment of my diagnosis and just sort of picture that whole scene with the urologist delivering the news. And under the influence of the MDMA, all I felt was this kind of overwhelming surge of compassion for the doctor. I just thought, you poor man, this is what you have to do every day for a job, and deliver this kind of news, and that must be so difficult. And, are you okay? And it just completely flipped the script for me. And I think maybe there's a lesson in that too, like having compassion for others can help release your own trauma. And I sort of came out of it just feeling much lighter and less encumbered by all that sort of stuff. Like something had really shifted and moved through me. And then I went back and I had a psilocybin session, which was what I was really interested in doing. And that was more around, making my peace with my mortality. And to be honest, I think I had really high expectations from the psilocybin because I'd done so much reading about it. And it was a little bit anticlimactic. I kind of just had the pretty visuals, but I didn't have any big epiphanies. And, I didn't feel like my ego was annihilated, or I had a audience with God or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I think it did have some lasting benefits. I feel like in the week or so afterwards, I was quite emotional, and I released a lot of pent up emotion and felt quite clear and a bit lighter. And then I went back for one more MDMA session because I just decided I had preferred the MDMA as a therapy. And that was much more around the breakup of my marriage, and I guess forgiving my ex-wife for the sense of hurt and abandonment, and just kind of making my peace with that, and understanding that, we'd come together and produced two beautiful children and had a really wonderful family life together, but this was my journey and not her journey, and there was no point carrying any of that kind of resentment. And that helped put a lot of those feelings to bed for me. So yeah, it's been hugely beneficial, and I was really stoked when I heard the news that the Therapeutic Goods Administration had rescheduled those drugs, and I think it's going to take a while for the bureaucracy and the medical mainstream to manage, delivering these therapies. But I think, like medicinal cannabis, I've seen that become very mainstream in quite a short space of time over the course of my diagnosis. And that's something else I've used throughout my diagnosis. and now medicinal cannabis is just considered so mainstream, it's no big deal, you know.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping psychedelic therapy will follow a similar trajectory, that once the authorities realize that, you know, the sky's not going to fall in and there aren't going to be all these sort of unintended adverse consequences, that will come to a really mature and sort of reasonable understanding of the benefits of these sorts of drugs, and that every human society through human history have used some sort of, you know, some sort of stimulants to access a sense of healing, or you know, I guess to kind of experience a different realm, and that can be done safely and with some ceremony and ritual by people who are very pure of their intent and are just there to help. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about that. I just hope that the rollout goes well, and that there aren't sort of, you know, adverse outcomes. And certainly the research shows that there have been very few sort of adverse reactions from people using those drugs in a therapeutic setting. And certainly, to my mind, they're a lot less toxic than a lot of, you know, mainstream pharmaceuticals that are prescribed all the time, you know?
Yeah. Agree. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
yeah. As I said, it's a favorite topic. You talk about it all day long.
Well, it sounds like a lot of benefits from just a few sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was a woman who I got speaking to after one of my sessions who'd also just had a session, and she said that she thought she'd got more benefit from, I think that was her third session, and that she'd got more benefit from that than 10 years of counseling. So I think, you know, people can have these really big breakthroughs. I think it's important that it's done as a part of a more traditional therapeutic sort of counseling approach. So you have preparation sessions and then integration sessions afterwards with a qualified counselor or a psychologist or psychiatrist. And so that you are really integrating the kind of insights and the kind of wisdom that I think comes through in those moments.
Yeah. And I just linking up, it's a bit similar to your writing work, the catharsis, writing for catharsis. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I never sort of envisaged any sort of I guess career path that was focused on sort of healing and catharsis. You know, I was just a working journalist, wrote about surfing, you know, surfing books. And so in some ways, you know, I can remember early on people saying things like, oh, you know, a cancer diagnosis can be a great gift. And I'd go, oh, fuck off, you know, you try it. But I'm sort of at the point where it does feel like it's gifted me a lot of things. You know, it's redesigned my life in ways that I don't think anything else could have. And I always say, you know, if I could wish away the cancer, I would, but I wouldn't wish away everything that I've learned along the way. And the two are inseparable. And I do think I'm a better person for the experience. And I do feel like I'm going to stay fit and healthy for the foreseeable future. And we are all going to die. And, you know, I've got a lot to be really, really grateful for. And that's a really nice place to find myself, having been through a lot of dark times.
Yeah, who would have thought connecting with mortality would have so many gifts?
Yeah, look, you know, the Buddha says it's our life's work to prepare for death. And, you know, I think for most of us, it's like the homework we put off until the last minute. You know, someone, you know, like each of us have had our confrontations with mortality, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I actually am going to die one day. And a cancer diagnosis is really a wake-up call to kind of do your homework, you know. And so for me, I think the book was kind of an exercise in me doing my homework, and the meditation, and yeah, a lot of the personal work I've done has been around making my peace with my mortality. And, you know, I don't think it's a destination you just arrive at and go, okay, now I've made my peace with my mortality. I think it's just it's a process, an ongoing kind of work in progress. And it's something I feel like I kind of chip away at. But I'm certainly much more comfortable with the idea that, this life is temporary, and everything's impermanent. And, today's an incredible day, and I'm never going to be gifted this day again. And I'm going to go make the most of it and live with joy and meaning, and, try and be a positive influence or impact on the people around me. So yeah, I've got, as I said, I've got lots to be grateful for, and it's hard to say I'm grateful for the cancer, and maybe that's something I've still got to work on, because I kind of like to think of it as a teacher, and when the student has fully learned their lessons, that the teacher can move on.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a nice way I've found of trying to frame it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You've definitely been a positive influence to me so far, and there's been times you've helped me, and I'm just so grateful, and so grateful for you coming on the podcast today and sharing your story and insights. And you're a gift to me. So thanks, Tim.
No, thanks, Ash. Mate, that's really lovely to hear. And you're doing the same thing, mate. I've watched your evolution over a long period of time, and I think we're on pretty similar paths, just trying to live authentically and make the best use of what we have to offer the world.
Yeah, I think so too. And where can people get in touch with you?
Well, I've got a website, bytimbaker.com, BYTIMBAKER, bytimbaker.com. I'm on Instagram as bytimbaker, and Twitter and Facebook. The book Patting the Shark is available through most bookstores. That's probably the greatest thing I have to kind of offer the world. I guess I'll be doing writing workshops periodically, so you could follow my social media, hear news about that. I'm speaking at a bunch of cancer conferences coming up, which has been a really unexpected thing. So I'm actually talking to the medical community about how to make cancer care more compassionate and holistic and integrative, and that's been an incredible opportunity. And that world has really surprised me how receptive they've been to the kind of things I'm talking about. So I couldn't be happier with the way the message is kind of rippling out into the world. It's super exciting.
Yeah, what an impact you're having. It's amazing. And I think people can demonize doctors and healthcare professionals, but for me, my experience is sometimes I perceive a lack of sensitivity, but they care. And that I can imagine that they really are open to what you have to share, because they do care about people, which is why they got into that work in the first place.
No, it's been super encouraging, and I sense a real shift in that world where they really want to hear about the patient experience, and that's why I've been given a kind of platform, I guess, because people have read the book and then wanted me to share that message. So as I said, absolutely stoked that it seems to be having such a positive impact in a whole lot of different settings.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Tim.
Absolute pleasure, Ash.
All right. Thanks for being on Beyond Turning Points.
Take care, mate.